just games, any rule is arbitrary. Casey Martin wants to use a golf cart, and the audience, the people who watch golf, are fine with it, then yes, he can use it. But Michael Sandel disagrees with Judge Scalia. The first point he says is because there is honor in sports, there is real honor in sports. People spend their entire lives trying to win an Olympic medal. Since there is honor in a sport, there is a purpose in a sport. And Judge Scalia is wrong in saying that a sport is just a game. It's not random, it's not arbitrary. The second point Michael Sandel makes is that Judge Scalia must not be a fan of sports. It was his joke. So what I want you to tell me is whether or not you think, not what Judge Scalia thinks, not what the PGA thinks, not what Casey Martin thinks, but do you think that Casey Martin is justified in using a golf cart in professional golfing tournaments? Let's take a poll. Raise your hand if you think Casey Martin is allowed to use a golf cart. I know that today golf carts are allowed, but imagine the time before golf carts were allowed. Raise your hand if you think Casey Martin was justified in fighting for the use of golf carts. Was allowed to, was justified in using golf carts. Okay. Raise your hand if you think Casey Martin was unjustified in asking to use a golf cart. All right. So let's hear this time first from the minority. Why do you think Casey Martin was not justified fighting to use a golf cart?
Because when you play sports, you naturally need to obey rules. And in this case, whether you agree or not, PGA did not allow any players to use golf cart. Therefore, he could fight against PGA to change the rule, but at least in that environment, I don't think he shouldn't be allowed to use golf carts and be an exception.
That's good. And what's your name?
It's Kay.
Kay says that rules are rules. If the PGA created rules where golfers are not allowed to use golf carts, then Casey Martin has to follow those rules. Kay, let me tell you the argument that Casey Martin made.
Sure.
In 1990, the United States of America passed an act called the Americans with Disabilities Act. It said that handicapped people, including handicapped athletes, need to be able to use the tools necessary to make up for that handicap. Casey Martin says he would rather trade his golf cart for a healthy leg any day. Kay says rules are rules, and Casey Martin doesn't disagree with that. But Casey Martin says because he's disabled, because he's handicapped, he should be able to use a golf cart. So let's hear from the majority this time. Why did you think that Casey Martin does have the right, is morally justified in asking for a golf cart? Okay.
Because there are two reasons. I think. First, if we introduce a golf cart into the game, disabled people also have the right to enjoy golf, and that will allow these people to enjoy the golf. And second, I think walking is not so essential in golf game. And that's great.
That's great. And what's your name?
Yuki.
Yuki has two reasons. First of all, Yuki says disabled people should also be allowed to play golf. The second point Yuki says is, well, maybe walking is not an essential part of golf. Before I tell you how the Supreme Court ultimately decided on the case, let's see if the one person in the minority wants to respond to Yuki.
Well, I also believe that even disabled people definitely have the right to play golf, but I think it's rather different from playing golf in a professional tournament. I mean, playing golf in a professional tournament is, I think, different from just playing the golf when you use the golf cart. So if you want to play golf in a professional tournament, I believe that all the players should obey the rules.
He says rules are rules. If you want to use a golf cart, do it on your own free time. Create your own tournament. Name it the Golfers on Golf Carts Association. Now, the Supreme Court ultimately decided that Casey Martin is allowed to use golf carts. That's why today people are allowed to use golf carts in professional tournaments. What did the Supreme Court say? Well, the Supreme Court said, just like Kiki said, walking is not an essential part of golf. The primary purpose of golf, said the U.S. Supreme Court, is to get the ball in the hole in as few strokes as possible. This is what the Supreme Court said. And there was a second argument. The second argument was against the advantages that Casey Martin supposedly had. Many people who, like Kate, said Casey Martin should not be allowed to use the golf cart, provided this reason. They said Casey Martin has an unfair advantage. He has an unfair advantage over his competitors to be using the golf cart, because they said golf is a test of people's physical, mental, and emotional capacities. Walking, the stress involved, especially on a hot summer day like today, makes you tired. You lose your concentration. And they said Casey Martin, by going on a golf cart, he is at a very big advantage. Well, the doctors checked it out. The doctors looked at Casey Martin's case, and they found out that Casey Martin, it hurt him. He was in great pain just to get in and out of the golf cart. So obviously, said the Supreme Court, Casey Martin does not enjoy a great advantage. So let's go on and see how far we can take this case. We argued, most people here said Casey Martin was justified in asking for the golf cart. So let's examine a different case. Suppose there was a swimmer. And suppose this swimmer also had a bad leg. This swimmer uses flippers to swim. Those flippers that you put on your feet. And let's say this swimmer says because she has a leg injury, a permanent leg injury, she's justified in using flippers. Would you, as the judge of this new controversial Supreme Court case, be justified? Well, do you think she's justified in using those flippers? This is similar to Casey Martin's case. Be careful, because you might just change the fundamental nature of swimming. Let's take a poll. Raise your hand if you think that this young handicapped girl, let's call her Diana. Do you think Diana is justified in using flippers? Raise your hand if you think she is justified in using flippers. And raise your hand if you think that she's not justified in putting on flippers during swimming competitions. Okay, so what's fundamentally different from this case and Casey Martin's case? Does anyone want to tell me what's different between these two cases? Okay.
Because walking is not essential part of golf, but flipper is quite essential.
Yuki says, well, in swimming, you swim. And if you have flippers, you swim faster. This is an essential part of swimming. That's good, that's good. Now, the thing is though, perhaps it might be possible that we are biased towards the current nature of sports. What do I mean? What about baseball? Imagine a situation where baseball doesn't exist. And let's say someone has